Gnostics were overwhelmed by what became the Catholic Church, the literalist faction, but in the early days there was an interesting phenomena going on with the Gnostics, and they certainly valued the psilocybes. We know about the Gnostics, fortunately, because a group of Gnostics at a place called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt buried a library of their texts in the 400s, round about the time that they were suffering the worst persecution. And that Nag Hammadi library stayed buried until 1945. As a result of that discovery, we now can allow the Gnostics to speak for themselves. Previously, our knowledge of Gnosticism was based on the statements of those who had persecuted the Gnostics, so highly unreliable. The take-home message is that the entity who we have been taught to believe is God, the entity called Jehovah or Allah or Yahweh or God, was for the Gnostics the demiurge, a kind of demon. The movie The Usual Suspects said the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world that he did not exist. The Gnostics would change that slightly and say the greatest trick the devil ever played would be to convince the world that he is God. He's the chief of the Archons, who are sort of evil angels that mingle with humanity and lead us onto paths that are hostile to the nature of the soul. And he's a malicious, egotistical, minor supernatural. He's jealous, he's angry, he tells Abraham to murder his own son. He's the ghastly creature. Actually, if you look at the statements and behavior of this entity in the Old Testament, and we're told that we are the creature who's going to dominate the world. There's all sorts of really horrible ideas in that miasma of text, and sitting at the top of it is this thing which, from the Gnostic point of view, wasn't God at all. I realize that this is very disturbing to those who are committed to the Christian message. Who's the bad guy in the Garden of Eden story? The serpent. Okay? He goes to Adam and Eve, he goes to Eve, and he says, you have to have knowledge of good and evil, you've got to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that's portrayed as a terrible thing that he did. It's the fall of man, supposedly the fall of man. From the Gnostic point of view, the serpent is the hero of the story. The serpent is the good guy, because from the Gnostic point of view, knowledge of good and evil is essential for the progress of the soul. If we live in a farmed, protected universe where we're just these kind of meat robots without any consciousness, and we don't know any difference between good and evil, and we can't make any choices, how can we possibly grow? How can we possibly develop? We live in a university of duality. I'm not saying, that's a phrase used by a friend of mine, I'm not saying that duality is all there is, but the suggestion is that on this plane of existence, duality has lessons to teach us, and that's what good and evil are about. So it's fascinating when we look at the Gnostic image of the tree of life that it's a psychedelic mushroom. Not a tree, but a visionary agent. When we look at the whole Garden of Eden story, we can see that the serpent is a therianthrope, almost always depicted as a human-headed serpent. So, for eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden in humiliating ways, beaten about the bottom with the edge of swords. Angels are posted at the edges of the garden to keep them out, lest they find their way to the tree of life. We've been taught, we've taken it in with our mother's milk since childhood, that this is right, this is the right thing. But actually, what is going on here? Here is the learning of the knowledge of good and evil leads to the expulsion from the garden. What kind of God is that? Same goes with the flood. According to the Gnostics, it was not inflicted to punish evil, but to punish humanity for having risen so high and to take the light, the gnosis that was growing amongst men, and the survivors were thrown into great distraction and into a life of toil so that mankind might be occupied with worldly affairs and might not have the opportunity of being devoted to the human spirit. The Gnostic notion is that there is a divine spark within all of us, and that the demiurge and the archons, their project is to snuff that divine spark out. And we can only awaken it through revealed knowledge, through gnosis. And the suggestion is that revealed knowledge for the Gnostics was connected with psychedelic experience. Throughout history, those who've sought the liberating gnosis have been persecuted. And although the stamping out of early Gnosticism in the Middle East goes back to about the 400s AD, 400 or 500s, there was a more recent form of Gnosticism which found its way into southern France. And these are the famous Cathars, who lived in the area that we call the Languedoc or Occitania today. They were, in many ways, an extraordinarily beautiful civilization. If you go back to the 12th century, they were in favor of universal literacy. They invented and distributed paper. They believed in the absolute equality of men and women. It was the Cathar society that produced the troubadours and their amazing art. There was a flourishing civilization that would have moved, I think, in interesting directions of human freedom if it had been allowed to evolve. But they had one problem, which is that they regarded the Pope as the agent of the devil on earth. And that was a very dangerous thing to do in the 12th century. And as a result, a crusade was declared against them. It was called the Albigensian Crusades, named after the town of Albi, one of the Cathar towns. And really terrible things happened. This army came down from northern France, seething with harm and anger, and they entered into the Cathar lands and they just murdered everybody. There was one famous occasion when one of the generals came to the leader of the crusade and pointed out that some Catholics were living in the city of Béziers. What was to be done about them? And the pontiff, the leader simply said, "Kill them all. God will choose his own. God will know his own." Horrible, horrible incident of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the relatively recent past. And of course, the burnings at the stake. Consider what it takes, the mental state you've got to be in to burn a fellow human being at the stake. I mean, I can't think of a more ghastly way to die. And some who've been burnt at the stake, which is actually a form of human sacrifice, let's face it. I mean, that's what's happening when people are burnt at the stake by the Catholic Church in the past. It's a human sacrifice which is being offered to their God, their perhaps demonic God. It's a ghastly, ghastly death. So if you're going to inflict that on the human being, another human being, what is going on in your mind that you would actually do that? And it was done cheerfully, and in huge numbers. The Cathars were burnt at the stake, their books were destroyed, utter destruction. And from the Gnostic point of view, the Demiurge and his Archons and their human servants, they're always trying to steal the light. And they're certainly doing so today. And if there's light growing, and I think it is, then we can be sure that tremendous archonic forces are working to suppress it. And if we take the hypothesis that the Gnostic scenario is correct, just for the sake of argument, then how might we expect these forces to manifest? Well, like this. The priests, the rabbis, the mullahs of the three Abrahamic faiths, those three faiths that have been responsible for so much horror in the world over the last 2,000 years, are still at it. They're still the jealous intermediaries who impose themselves between us and the divine, who do not want us to have direct contact with the realm of spirit, and who I would say have been systematically misguiding humanity and are at the source of the terrible problems that we confront in the world today. The Gnostics would say, don't look at what they say, look at what they do. Because they all talk the talk of peace and love and harmony, but the walk they walk is often very different. Women are still being stoned to death in Islamic societies today. For what? Being unfaithful to their husbands? What? And in the name of God? This is obviously insane. It's completely insane. It's only early 1700s was the last burning at the stake, and we know the ongoing problems of the Catholic Church. The mass murder recently of the minority Yazidis in Iraq by Islamic State. The Yazid religion has its roots in ancient Gnosticism. We all saw this story. I would say, I hate the fact it calls itself Isis, after a wonderful ancient Egyptian goddess, but I would say it's just another Abrahamic death cult. There's plenty of them. They've been littering the human story for a very long time. It's just the latest example of another Abrahamic death cult. And then another archonic force is the state itself, which takes our money and our power and turns it into bureaucracies, which then control us and claim that they are acting in our interests and running our lives. That's basically depriving us of the right to responsibility, to making responsible choices as adults. That's what the state constantly militates against.